Okay, good morning, everyone. Thanks very much for coming to this seminar here at the Institute for Climate Risk and Response. This is our monthly seminar. It's my great pleasure to welcome Professor Liz Thurbon. Just before we start, I'd like to acknowledge the Bedjigal people of the Eora Nation, who are the traditional custodians of the land on which we are gathering, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So Liz is a Professor of International Political Economy at UNSW Sydney, and she's also Director of the Green Energy Statecraft Project. Her research focuses on governments, how governments can harness economic statecraft to drive the clean energy transition, with a particular focus on Australia's opportunity to position itself as a renewable energy superpower. Very topical at the moment, given the COP is about to kick off. She's a co-author of Developmental Environmentalism by Oxford University Press and serves on the World Economic Forum's Global Future Council on Equitable Transition. She's also been a great friend of ICRR over the last year, I suppose. We participated in the event that you ran here in June, and then you came along to our industry forum last week and we had a very useful, excellent discussion on all things COP. It was great. And so I'm really looking forward to hearing a bit more about this Green Energy Statecraft project and how it fits in with the current national and international conversation. So thank you very much, Liz.
Thank you so much. And hello, welcome everyone, and hello everyone online. Thanks for the very warm welcome. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land that we're meeting on today and pay my respects to elders past and present. Extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today and online, of course. It's a really great pleasure to introduce, or have the opportunity to introduce to you, the Green Energy Statecraft project. And I appreciate in the abstract for today, it started with the idea that we'll talk about the origins of the concept. And I think that's a pretty good place to start. And so I will just beg your forgiveness for doing a real origin story back in the 70s. This is where I grew up, in Sussex Inlet, the land of the Doga people. We had a little caravan park on the Jervis Bay Nature Reserve side. And my grandfather in the 1940s who had been a poultry farmer in Sydney, but during the war, but somehow came to secure a lease on this beautiful, pristine spot on the inlet in Sussex. And so I grew up there really in splendid isolation. So isolated, in fact, that in the winter months, there were very few people except my family, my mum, dad, my brother and I, and we would have to travel to school by boat each day up the estuary to Sussex Inlet proper to go to our little school. So it was a really isolated existence and really wrapped in nature and wonder, but it was also quite an insulated existence insofar as my parents were really interested in domestic politics and in questions of social justice, but we really didn't talk at all about the world. I had very little idea of what was going on in the world. And even when I went to boarding school in Sydney, age 12, given the isolated circumstances, I didn't learn very much about international politics. And certainly I had no idea that during this really quiet, serene 1970s, 80s existence, that on Australia's doorstep in Asia and in Northeast Asia in particular, we were witnessing one of the most remarkable social and economic and political transformations in history. In fact, we were seeing in Northeast Asia in particular, an industrial revolution happen in the space of what had taken, the front runner, our Western economies, about 200 years to achieve. This was being executed in the space of about 30 years. So these remarkable transformations taking place in our doorstep, and I had no idea whatsoever. So I happily went off to university when I finished school thinking, I'm going to have a career in the performing arts. This is going to be great. Rocked up, enrolled in and took some politics courses, and I enrolled in a course on the role of the state in economic development. It was just a timetabling thing, to be frank. This was the first time that I heard or learnt, was exposed to what was going on in our wider region. And not just the scale of the transformation that was happening, but how it was occurring. And the fact that actually, and you know, this will sound really obvious to everyone listening today, but that politics and economics are done really differently in different national contexts. And the role of the state in particular in the economy differs fundamentally. And the role of the state can have a incredibly catalytic and transformative role under certain circumstances. So this was really a revelation to me. And so I started taking more and more courses on this topic. And all of a sudden, I was somehow doing honours on the role of the state in Korea's techno-industrial transformation. And then I got a scholarship to do a PhD on the topic. And then all of a sudden, I was doing... forgotten the idea of the career in the performing arts, and I became a political scientist somehow, and found myself here at UNSW in 2003 as a lecturer in international political economy, teaching about Northeast Asian techno-industrial transformation and the circumstances under which some governments both commit to and develop the capacity for executing big transformative projects. And this certainly isn't to reify the Northeast Asian experience. So by Northeast Asia, I mean Japan, Korea, and Taiwan, and more recently China. Of course, the economic and the political transformations came with a lot of social dislocation as well. But that said, there was something quite remarkable, and not just what was happening in the region, but by comparative contrast, how different Australia was. How different the role of the government seemed to be in this context in terms of the level of ambition, the relative disregard for the structure of the economy, manufacturing doesn't matter very much, etc. So I found this a really interesting point of contrast. And that sparked my interest in trying to understand what if there was something that Australia could learn from the region. And again, I think this is something that we often don't ask in Australia or in the West. What can we learn? Can we learn from these remarkable transformative experiences that we're seeing in other contexts? I think this is a really crucial question that we ask ourselves now, because obviously we are standing at such a crucial moment in which transforming our economy is so important for existential reasons to do with climate change, but also for economic reasons to do with the future of what our economy is going to look like, for social reasons to do with the availability of good, well-paid jobs, which are crucial to human dignity, but also to social and political cohesion. So this is a really important time to think about the role of the government and indeed what we might be able to learn from other contexts. So while East Asia's development has formed the focus of a lot of my work, from the very start, from the mid-90s, early 2000s, the last 10 years or so, I've been examining the role of the state in Northeast Asia's process of economic greening, or more specifically, the green energy transition. And this produced a book recently in 2023. Don't buy it, it's free. You can download it thanks to the Australian government and therefore you guys, thanks to Australian taxpayers. So I wanted to start by giving just a little overview of what this book is about, because this speaks to the origins of the Green Energy Statecraft project, which is different from this book, but really the concept of the project has its origins here. So let me just very briefly give an overview of what myself and my excellent collaborators, Sonyong and Hao and John, were arguing. The analytical starting point for this book is that not just in Australia, but globally, there seem to be these two conflicting images. of East Asia's energy transition. On the one hand, we have East Asia reified as the leaders, especially China, ploughing billions of dollars into building and scaling the green energy industries of the future, absolutely outstripping the world in terms of the capacity of renewables installed, but also in driving a circular economy. So there's that image of the leader. But then, of course, there's the image of the laggard, dragging feet in international climate negotiations, while continuing to build out the renewables, still investing in coal-fired power generation. And emissions, until very recently, perhaps in China, we've now seen peak emissions, but until recently, emissions continuing unabated. And so the kind of central problem of this book was, how do you make sense of these conflicting images? And the purpose of the book wasn't to say that one is more true than the other. In fact, they're both right. They're both accurate empirical observations of what's happening. But rather, these conflicting images, we think, of Asia reflect three realities about the energy transition and the state's strategic role in it. Very briefly, the first reality is that the green energy shift is at its core a major techno-economic shift, like all the big techno-economic shifts we've seen in the past, from the horse and carriage, to the train and the car, etc. These disruptive changes. It's a techno-economic shift involving the process of creative destruction. To Joseph Pater, of course. So obviously, if you're a government and you want to speed the shift up, you have to simultaneously and successfully navigate these two dynamics. You have to build the new green energy industries of the future, and you have to scale down the fossil fuel industries of the past. And they sit in tension, obviously, because you can't scale down the old ones without building up the new ones first. Or can you? Sometimes in the West, I wonder if we think that we can actually do that. So you have to successfully navigate those tensions. But obviously, creation and destruction involve really different political constituencies and really different state capabilities. And some governments, for these reasons, might be more willing to experiment or play with the creative side over the destructive side, or vice versa. And so these realities are really going to shape a country's pattern of performance in the energy transition. So the aim of the book basically was to explain Northeast Asia's distinctive pattern of progress. And by distinctive, I mean that when you look at how Northeast Asia, and in the book we looked at South Korea and China, intentionally because they're different political systems, obviously, but we argue that they have more in common. They don't when it comes to the transition. This distinctive pattern of progress, what does it look like? Well, from about 2008, I would say, to 2015, we saw Northeast Asian governments, Korea and China in particular, pour vast sums of money into the creative side of things, building and scaling new clean energy industries, and not really talk about destruction at all. In the West, it was the opposite. At that time, we were really just talking about putting a price on carbon, but we weren't really serious about investing in new green energy creation. Of course, a price on carbon is important, but it was a really interesting, it was the reverse approach. Then from about 2015, we saw something very interesting happen, especially in China. And this was a growing interest in the destructive side, in the idea of how do you start phasing out fossil fuels? And so we started to see this creative and destructive ambition and capability on the part of the Chinese state, and to an extent in Korea as well, start to come into synergy. So their ambitions to create and destroy were beginning to synergize. So first of all, how do we explain that? Like, what were these governments doing? And what does this tell us about the future trajectory of the energy transition in East Asia? And what does that mean for us? That's where the Green Energy Statecraft project comes in, but let's not get there first. So in terms of explaining that, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but we used a theory and an analytical approach that we call developmental environmentalism. And this concept of developmental environmentalism explains the ambitions driving the energy shift and also the shape that it takes. So what is developmental environmentalism? First of all, it's a mindset. It's a philosophy. It's a way of thinking about the purpose of the economy, which is basically to build and strengthen the nation. Like Korea and China and indeed Japan and Taiwan, their governments historically have really thought that the economy has a political purpose to build and strengthen the nation in what is understood as quite a hostile international system. And that mindset also involves a particular way. It's not just building and strengthening the economy in aggregate, but they're concerned about a particular kind of economic strength centered on manufacturing capability and technological autonomy and export competitiveness, because these three things are seen as the kind of foundation of national security more broadly conceived. So that was a traditional developmental mindset that shaped policymaking in those countries from the 1960s. But we argue in the book that around 2008, there started to be a reimagining. Actually, the existing fossil-fueled model of industrialisation was no longer viable. It would no longer guarantee national security because of this huge dependence on the import of fossil fuels, which was a huge economic risk, and also because the world was moving towards, at that time, we were having greater discussions about climate change. So these governments were thinking long-term, thinking that if we want to maintain our strong economy, our manufacturing capability, our technological autonomy, and our export competitiveness, we need to shift our model. We need to start thinking about actually manufacturing energy security through renewables, manufacturing energy security, replacing fossil fuel imports with domestically manufactured energy, and then reaping the economic rewards associated with building and scaling those new green energy export-oriented industries of the future to capture first mover advantage. There wasn't a lot of talk about climate change, which isn't to say that that's a good thing or a bad thing, but it was a very different logic. So developmental environmentalism is, first of all, this mindset. It's about shifting the way of understanding the sources of national security through the energy transition in terms of economic and energy security, manufacturing your own energy security. But of course, retaining the central role for the government in that process. The government can and should help not displace capitalist market dynamics. And indeed, we see in China the increasing reliance on capitalist market dynamics to build domestic, internationally competitive firms. So this isn't about capitalism or not. This is about how states can strategically intervene to harness the process of creative destruction and speed up the energy transition. Developmental environmentalism is also a political legitimation strategy. In Korea and Japan and China, a strong economy has always been seen as the key to political legitimacy. But increasingly, again, from about 2008, 2010, the fossil-fueled model of industrialisation was causing real political legitimacy challenges, not least because of particulate pollution. In China and in Korea, a huge political legitimacy issue, again driving these countries to embrace the idea of reducing particulate pollution through the energy transition, and also addressing concerns about where a job's going to come from in the future, especially in Korea, China's increasing competitiveness. You know, what are we going to do? How are we going to keep ahead of China? Can we think about the frontier technology industries, green hydrogen in particular, making sense of that commitment to green hydrogen in Korea, which was seen as something that Korea had a real advantage in. So this was the energy transition as political strategy. And then as a distinctive policy approach, and by this I don't mean like the tools of policies, but an approach to sequencing, where you first of all build the new green energy industries of the future, because what East Asian governments did not want to do was replace imports of fossil fuels with imports of renewable energy technologies. No. They wanted to have technological autonomy and manufacturing capability in these crucial industries. So the idea was first you build, and then when you have captured first mover advantage and everyone else is playing catch up, then you can start talking about scaling down fossil fuel industries. And indeed, that's precisely what we're seeing now. So we argue that this concept of developmental environmentalism imagined as a mindset, a legitimation strategy, and a distinctive approach to sequencing the transition is what makes Northeast Asia's approach to greening so different from what we see in the West. And very interesting to think about the implications of that for us, because China is not reversing. You now have the market mechanism of creative destruction. You now have the cost, these are manufacturing industry, and these are manufacturing industries, and they are subject to the same logic of cost reduction as all manufacturing industries are. So when the more investment goes in, the more prices come down for renewables, the more investment therefore flows in. And this is, of course, why we now see global investment in renewables outstripping investment in fossil fuels by 2 to 1. So this isn't going to shift. So what does that mean for us? What does that mean for Australia? And what does that mean for the rest of the globe? And is there something that we can take away from this highly strategic approach to thinking about the purpose of the energy transition and about the role of the state in that transition? What can we take away? And that is the purpose of the Green Energy Statecraft project. I knew I would get to it at some point. I knew you guys are probably going, come on, Liz, when's this whole statecraft thing happening? Well, it's happening right now. It's happening at UNSW. And across our wonderful partners, and have some wonderful team members in the room today as well, Heidi and Chris, and Wes is online, I think, too, and hello to other team members. Big shout out to everyone. So the Green Energy Statecraft project really is about answering this question. What can we learn? How can we respond to these dramatic changes in the in energy trade and geostrategic manoeuvring that's going on? The first lesson we can learn, and this is the whole premise of the Green Energy Statecraft project, is that the energy transition is a massive national security multiplier. But we talk about national security in a way that is very broadly conceived. And this is really important because we're very attentive to the risks of over-securitization or like narrow securitization of particular issues. So what do we mean? The energy transition is a massive national security multiplier. China understands this. Because by speeding up the transition, you boost energy security by reducing your reliance on imported fossil fuels. You boost economic security by building and scaling the new technology-intensive, export-oriented industries of the future. You build environmental security by reducing particulate pollution and, crucially, reducing emissions. This is what was the missing piece of the Northeast Asian story. This is the crucial dynamic, of course, that sets the context. But it has been the dynamic that we have almost exclusively viewed the energy transition through in Australia. We don't tend to talk much about the other aspects. You boost social security through democratising access to energy, through energy sovereignty for communities, for First Nations communities. This is about community ownership of renewable energy, for Indigenous ownership of renewable energy. There are incredible opportunities here as well. There are also risks, of course. This isn't to say that this is a simple thing to achieve. This is an ideal type. And then geostrategic security, what do I mean by that? Well, if you speed up the energy transition, we can deepen our new energy partnerships with countries in the region like Japan and Korea, who are really finding it hard to decarbonise. I mean, China's quite good at decarbonising itself, let me just say. But our neighbours, Japan and Korea, very difficult for them to decarbonise, especially they're hard to abate sectors like steel. We can become crucial partners. We can deepen our collaborations. Crucially, we can repair our relationships with our Pacific Island neighbours, where our attitude and position on climate change and, you know, on the one hand, speeding up renewables, but also opening new gas fields, you know, this is not coherent. This is not coherent. So we can create new partnerships by projecting a better green image and actuality to the region, which is really important in this particular historical moment. So the question is then, if that's what can be done, how do you get there? And this is the question that sits at the heart of the Green Energy Statecraft project. What kind of governance approaches, what new governance approaches might enable policymakers to speed up the transition, and in doing that to advance this comprehensive security enhancing agenda, economic, energy, environmental, social, geostrategic? So the first part of our project was a little bit of sociological ideal type building. Thanks, Max Weber. And, you know, we love a good sociological problem to solve. So what we did was through an analysis of our understanding of the Northeast Asian experience, but also looking to other countries that have managed to excel in those various aspects of security. This is what we argue a more ambitious, geostrategically informed, whole of nation approach to governing the green energy transition might involve. We're not talking about particular policies here. We're not even talking about particular institutions. We're talking about a disposition, a policymaking disposition and architecture that might have some hope of stopping this siloed approach that we have taken in Australia and continue to take, to start getting serious about pursuing a more ambitious and coordinated approach to governing the transition. So at the top, it won't surprise you, having just heard the way in which we've gone about studying Northeast Asia, we start with the mindset. This is the way people think, the way that policymakers think about the purpose of the transition. What are we doing the transition for? In this, in Green Energy Statecraft, we argue that we're doing the transition because it's the key to unlocking these comprehensive security benefits for the nation and for the globe. Then we have domestically oriented energy statecraft. This is the building and the scaling, the new green industries of the future. Historically in Australia, we might have talked about industry policy. That's a bit 1980s, first of all. Can't talk about industry policy in Canberra, let me tell you, like well, that's not there. But there is, and quite rightly, I think, it's a bit tarnished because of historical experimentations and failures. Because we didn't, in Australia, we haven't ever really taken a highly disciplined approach to industry policy. But also I think industry policy sounds quite ad hoc, right? And it doesn't really capture the level of ambition and external orientation and aspirations for global competitiveness that the term statecraft does. So we talk about domestically oriented statecraft, that's your green energy industry building. The externally oriented statecraft is about how do you ensure that your aid, trade, investment and finance entanglements bilaterally, plurilaterally, multilaterally with our region, with the globe, how do we ensure that they support rather than constrain our ambitions to transition our economy? So for example, do existing trade agreements limit the ability of our government to act more strategically when it comes to industry building? They're the kinds of questions we would ask. The financial foundations of green energy statecraft speak to the reality that this transition is not happening without finance. finance is the lifeblood of the economy, and finance, as I'll explain it with a couple of concrete examples, finance is so crucial. So how do you reform the financial sector to ensure that it's pointed at delivering low-cost, long-term finance to project proponents across the board? Green commodities, transmission building, renewables scale out, circular economy initiatives. Because if the finance is high, as we know, the cost of energy will be high. So if you want to get the cost of renewable energy down, the best way to do that is to access cheap finance. Every 1% extra cost of capital is about a 10% extra cost of energy. So this is really key. And in the middle, and last but not least, and I say last but not least because it's in the middle, because it's at the heart, it's building a social and political consensus for the energy transition. And you do this through an attentiveness to a just transition, to a sustainable transition, to a transition that actually delivers for people in communities, in households, in regions, First Nations. Not primarily because that's the right thing to do, but also because without the social and political consensus, again, we don't have a transition. As we see in Australia, we get fractured political support. We get the idea that the energy transition is bad for people and something to be resisted. And we have to do the hard work of understanding. I mean, of course, there are some pretty big interests against, economic interests against the energy transition. But there are also some really understandable concerns where the transition has been sped up and it hasn't been just. So this is really crucial. So the Green Energy Statecraft project, with this amazingly wonderful team, is about exploring how to shift Australia towards a more statecraft-like disposition and set of actions when it comes to the transition. We are looking at how you can enhance security through the energy transition. We're collaborating across the board to understand the governance framework, how this can be implemented, identifying and overcoming obstacles, and of course building a non-partisan dialogue, because really, this is so interesting again in Northeast Asia. It's been conservative governments that have been pushing so hard for the transition because they understand the link between the energy transition and security, right? Narrowly conceived often. So we need to start thinking about a language and a story that can unite us behind the energy transition. So that's very much the kind of work that we've been up to. What does that look like in practice? Let me just give you two examples of policies that we are proposing and co-designing and spinning out at the moment. So one is a Clean Commodities Trading Initiative to help kickstart Australia's green iron industry in particular, but also other clean commodities industries like sustainable aviation fuel, for example. And we also know that this is really crucial because we are facing a cliff for our existing export model. We already know that Northeast Asia is decarbonising. They're our biggest consumer for our fossil-fuelled exports and also our iron. So we know that as that decarbonisation continues, the demand for these commodities is going to decrease. But, talk about being kicked in the ass with a rainbow. With green iron in particular, this is our largest export industry. But if we shift to green iron, that is processing the iron onshore using renewable energy, wind, solar, hydrogen, we can triple the value of our iron exports. We can also then help Japan and Korea decarbonise their steel manufacturing, and steel accounts for between 8 and 11% of global emissions. So this is a huge environmental imperative, an economic imperative, but we can also create new jobs, and we can also deepen those partnerships with Japan and Korea, which is really important. So this is a really incredible opportunity, but we have this huge problem in Australia. We have lots of projects that are identified, ready to go, the sites, the firms, they're all willing, and no one is investing. No one is moving to final investment decision. Why? We argue that the existing suite of policies, while really they could be helpful further down the track, but at the moment, they are not addressing the biggest problem facing project proponents, which is they don't have what we call bankable demand. They can't demonstrate that there are buyers for these really expensive green commodities. Who's going to buy the expensive green iron? And if you don't have a buyer, you can't raise the finance. And at the moment, the supply side supports from production tax credits and other subsidies aren't giving the financiers the confidence that actually at the end of it, these projects will be viable economically. So if you want to kickstart clean commodities industries, Oliver Yates and I are arguing that you have to solve the problem of demand. How do you do that? You do it in ways that governments across the globe have done, that our government does, when it wants to kickstart anything, when it wants a new hospital, you write a contract. When you want a toll road, you write a contract. If you want a green iron plant, write a contract. Say that we will buy a certain volume of your green iron at a certain price over a certain period. And then without the government even spending any money from that point, because the government shouldn't give any money until the product's produced, the firm can take that contract and say, look, I have a buyer. And that and not just a buyer, but a buyer that's really secure. It's the government. So you can get low cost finance for your green iron plant. Okay, so that is a simple way that you can move these projects to financial close. Then you might say, well, what is the government going to do then? What about this risk? In 7 years' time, when the plant's up and running, is the government going to buy all this really expensive green iron? So we say no. There is actually quite a simple solution for that. When the project is completed and the iron is produced, the government can instruct the firm to sell that iron into regular markets without the green premium. So you split the physical commodity from the environmental attribute. You sell the green iron, regular prices, regular markets. And for the environmental attributes, you create clean commodity certificates, and the governments can bank those certificates and then sell them into established markets. And the government then can earn its money back for supporting industry. So this is moving away from subsidies, away from one directional taxpayers' funds to companies that might not ever produce, to actually saying, we will give you the kind of support that you want, that you need to raise finance, and do so in a way where you only are paid if you actually produce, and then the government gets the upside of that and can recycle that support. So that's an example of what we would call Green Energy Statecraft. It's designed to solve economic, energy, environmental, and then we can talk about, well, how do you design these contracts for social benefit, for example? And eventually, we might even partner with Japan and Korea. Maybe they would like to co-invest in the Clean Commodities Trading Initiative. Our governments can collectively write offtake contracts and share in the upside. And so it could have a really important geostrategic dimension as well. That's one example. There's a picture, we can come back to that. The other example, and again, Oliver Yates is the brain behind this. He was the inaugural CEO of the Clean Energy Finance Corporation. And this is a solution for ailing industrial assets. For example, like Tomago, been in the news recently, Australia's largest aluminium smelter. Nothing wrong with the smelter, it just can't get the energy that it needs at an affordable price or at a price to make it globally competitive. We have at the moment, it's reliant on coal-fired power. We know that that's not sustainable. Those stations are coming to the end of their life, and it's also really expensive. You might say, well, what about gas? Gas is also really expensive. The only real option for viability for Tomago and other assets like it is to solve its energy problem. At the moment, all of the solutions being proposed are about giving a lifeline to the Tomago smelter itself that's owned by Rio Tinto. And really, these are kind of band-aid solutions. They're not addressing what is the crucial problem, which is we need a massive build-out of cheap green energy. The problem is that Tomago itself can't act as the off-taker for that energy because it's in trouble already. So no bank is going to lend to the renewables to build out power under those circumstances. So again, we say, here again, through a scheme finance vehicle, the government could stand in between the renewables producers and Tomago, write power purchasing agreements for the renewables and deliver affordable green energy to Tomago. And again, earn that upside back, and might be necessary to take in an upside of the aluminium during times of peak prices to help recoup some of that investment. But again, these are solutions that move us beyond the old way of supporting industry, which is this one way, throw money at the problem, not really knowing if it's going to be a long-term solution. And so we would say that these are just two examples. That to go back for a moment, we would say that whatever policies we develop into the future, whatever projects the government decides to support, with what is now billions of dollars in funds committed through the NRF and the CEFC and ARENA, we should be asking ourselves, when the government commits money, how can we ensure that we maximise for energy security, for economic security, for environmental security, for social security, and for geostrategic security? We should have some kind of framework that allows us to assess the viability of projects across the multiple security domains. I'll probably, leave it there for questions, if that is helpful. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Liz. Questions from the room or questions from online? So we'll take questions from the room first.
So this is an interesting problem. The Gulf stations had energy security issue. That was the driving force. And for a country like Australia, it's the threat of losing market. Now, whether the transition that Australia requires will take place or not depends on the policy stability that comes from the political market. What's happening now is one example. So until the political parties come to the realization of this problem, it will continue. And Australia will be laggard. And in the case of like green steel or so on, so by 2030 or something, 35 or something, Europeans have said that if you don't come with this carbon tax, we'll put border carbon tax adjustment mechanism. So there's some kind of hope or premium for those kind of steels, and there's a time to prepare for this. So these industries like tobacco or someone, it's time for them to install their own energy production system in bit to supply the required power to them. So there is a need for change in the whole paradigm of this. So this is all probably that's why your team is working on this, teaching all these things to them. Hopefully that'll work.
Thank you. Well, I hope so too. But I think that you are right. That this isn't a technical problem. The energy transition, we have the technologies, really. I mean, of course, there are always going to be frontier technologies and ways of doing things cheaper and faster through breakthroughs. But we know that we have the technologies that we need in Australia to do the transition. What we don't have is the political consensus. And I think that this is the way that we speak to that problem in the project, is to say, you know, and this isn't cynical because it's true, but the way that we have tended to advocate for the energy shift in Australia has been almost solely through the lens of addressing the climate challenge and through net zero, which are, of course, they're, you know, scientifically, these are important, but they have been very open to exploitation, those issues, by people who would not like to see the energy transition proceed. And unfortunately, we have an incredibly fractured consensus now, as we're seeing in the papers every day. So socialising the idea of the energy transition being about multiple security pursuits, we think is really important. And again, it's not cynical. It's not saying, oh, we'll just say it's about these other securities, but really it's just about climate change. Actually, it is about all of them. And we know, you know, China hasn't built the world's largest renewable energy system because it's trying to address the climate crisis, right? We know that China is driven by economic and energy security concerns. So we know that these are real. And that they're legitimate ambitions. But what we're saying, and this model, you know, this goes beyond what's happening in Northeast Asia. And I really should make this point. So we have seen energy and economic security and environmental security through the lens of particulate pollution, not necessarily climate change, have been important. Social security, increasingly geostrategic, in China's case, yes, not so much Korea, maybe a bit more now. But what we're saying is that in the ideal time, you can and should maximise for all of these. This is what a comprehensive approach looks like, and we should be able to get behind this as a country. The other issue, you're right, is that because of this lack of consensus, it has made a lot of policies not bankable. So, for example, the production tax credits that have been proposed and, you know, now in place for the government for green iron, they're not bankable. Like, you can't raise finance for your project with the promise of a production tax credit because the opposition has said it's going to repeal them. We don't want production tax credits. So which banks are going to lend on the basis of those? So again, we need to come up with solutions that aren't, and this is why we say, you know, the government should use, and we're not arguing that the government should own the iron plant. You know, some people say, oh, is this communism? Is this socialism? I'm like, no. We're not saying the government should own the iron plant. We're not saying that the government, you know, should stockpile big piles of clean commodities. What we're saying is the government should take a sensibly really what is quite a modest approach of issuing a demand contract, something that it does all the time, and then assuming the risk for the part of the project that the government controls, which is the price of the green premium. That depends on a carbon price, the price of the green premium. And guess what? The government sets the carbon price. So, you know, this is a risk that should rightly lie with the government and let the firms, the private firms, do what they do best, which is do the project risk.
So it resonates a lot with the example, for example, of sovereignty in Northeast Asian countries over products like rice,
Yes.
where they could import it more cheaply, but for very, historical reasons, they say we cannot risk that we import our rice and then people cut off the imports. So we will, invest in that we actually are going to grow, even if it's more expensive, our own rice.
Yeah.
But from my experience here, the economy is based off of what we take out of the ground and what we build on top of it. So we don't have a lot of this kind of manufacturing mindset. So is it that we would need to shift that mindset as well?
Yes, definitely. We call this structural agnosticism, right? It doesn't matter if we produce potato chips or computer chips, right? So for some economists, they're of equal merit, when we actually know that no. Commodities themselves and agricultural products, subject to huge price fluctuations, but also that manufacturing has all attendant benefits to do with supply chain resilience, to do with skilled jobs, to do with innovation, supporting higher value services industries. At the moment, we see servicification of a lot of economies, and that's not moving into high value services. Like when you don't have manufacturing, you don't have the design, you don't have the legals. We are moving in Australia. We've hollowed out manufacturing and we've kind of gone into the lower value servicification. I mean, standing here in a university, like with an education service, so there are some obvious exceptions, but we have to get real about manufacturing. That is absolutely right. And that's not to say that we should do everything ourselves. Like I'm not arguing for autarky, but rather, in Northeast Asia, it's long been understood that some manufacturing capability is really important. We saw it in COVID. I don't need to labour the point, but it is a mindset shift. So where does this mindset come from that manufacturing doesn't matter, right? Where does it come from? There's a lot of, I think, in economics training, especially mainstream economics, about this kind of structural agnosticism. I think that is quite prevalent. In Australia, we think of economics very narrowly, teach economics really differently in other places around the globe. So there is more than just Friedman and Hayek. Schumpeter. Yes.
I have a couple of questions. The first relates to this environmental security, and the second relates to social security. They're sort of unrelated questions, but they kind of sort of similar in my head. First question, with this sort of focus on climate and energy, which is obviously a topic, how are ambitions in terms of, for example, biodiversity conservation built into the thinking? And can the biodiversity crisis be considered alongside the climate crisis? These are
inextricably, yeah, you can't.
Yeah, so how is that kind of the biodiversity aspect of that built into this kind of thinking?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And I mean, environmental security is this really broad bucket. And obviously I've been talking about particulate pollution and emissions reduction. But absolutely, this is, and this builds into the just and sustainable transition at the heart of the model. So there is a real risk with the energy transition. There's a lot of extractivism. I'm talking about iron, right? So that's an extractive. So there's a lot of extractivism, there's critical minerals. There is the absolute real chance that we repeat the awful experience of the past and of the present, let's face it. So that is, I would say, absolutely a part of this approach.
And then that sort of links to my second question, which sort of there's this sort of strong assumption of a strong state capacity and with certain kind of vulnerabilities that might come to the fore. And so the sort of, obvious question is sort of what safeguards are needed to ensure that corruption, greenwashing, these kinds of risks are mitigated and avoided.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And in fact, a big part of the research So the Green Energy Statecraft project has a very strong engagement and policy aspect, but underpinning that is, you know, the academic research, and central to that are questions of state capacity. So how do you maximise the opportunities and minimise the obvious risks associated? And there are real risks associated with rent seeking, associated with, you know, poor decision making, lack of capability to, like, we've not done industry planning in this country. What does that even mean in this context? How do you discipline, like, support for industry? And by discipline, I mean make it conditional on performance outcomes, and not just economic performance outcomes, reaching tech upgrading or export goals or etc., but environmental conditions as well. So that is a very live question. And in fact, you know, this has, wherever you are advocating for a stronger role for the government, of course, there are attendant risks. I guess the flip side is, what happens if the government doesn't take a more ambitious and strategic approach to the transition? Will it happen slower? It happens messier, and our energy prices, the first thing that happens really is our energy prices will continue to go up, because it's that uncertainty, it's this messy stage of the transition that's being managed so poorly, this inability to plan, coordinate, scale, finance at scale, that means that we will stay in this messy part where energy prices are, you know, linked to kind of gas peaking prices, you know. So this is a huge energy security issue. So that's what happens if the government doesn't do it. Let alone you forfeit the huge potential rewards. So I think the cost of the potential risks associated with a more ambitious and strategic role for the government are offset by the costs of inaction. And I think I also should say, you know, I don't want to reify policymakers in Northeast Asia. I mean, like, China's doing a remarkable job, let me just say, like with its energy transition. It's certainly not perfect by any stretch. And, you know, before that, Korea and Japan and Taiwan achieved remarkable things through coordinated state action. But they made lots of mistakes. Their governments had a risk tolerance because the goal was viewed as essential, like this is a security issue, therefore we have a higher risk tolerance for some failure. We acknowledge that we will have to learn as we do. And also, these policymakers aren't superhuman. They're just like us, right? So, like, they learn really fast under huge pressure to deliver what was deemed to be a nationally important task. So we have to learn it, and we can, you know, we can be really good at this. But we won't be really good at it if we don't give it a go.
I know there's more questions. I'm just going to get Wes, who's patiently sitting in virtual world. Wes, you had a question.
Yes. Thanks, Liz, for an amazing presentation. I love the way you actually started with small town, South Coast, New South Wales, because I think there is a disjunct between the way that we understand our economy and the way that it is actually enmeshed intimately in, you know, the economies of Northeast Asia. And so the developmental states in Northeast Asia, they shape our economy in lots of ways, right? Like our exports of coal, gas, iron ore, all our biggest exports depend on essentially the statecraft of these other countries, of Japan, of China. To get to a question, it's not very well thought out, but it seems to me that key parts of the Australian state, like Treasury, like DFAT, they're still committed to neoliberal orthodoxies about a limited role for the state, about market-led development, about free trade. You know, it just, and we had kind of a consensus on this in Australia from the late 1980s, right? This idea of economic rationalism and, you know, we'll just remove tariffs and we compete in the global economy and that's how we'll find our comparative advantage. But this idea of state-led development for the purposes of, green energy and security. So the question is, how do you think we get to a consensus, a new consensus, and are you seeing resistance from those key thinkers?
That's a really great question. And I agree, Wes. So when I started this project, I thought, okay, well, probably one of the biggest blockers is going to be a kind of lack of openness to new and creative ways of imagining the role of government in the transition. And that is true to a certain extent. But what I would say is I've had the enormous privilege of, so across 3 Green Iron summits in Gladstone, in Perth, in Adelaide, I had the enormous privilege of sitting in the room with all of the industry proponents, environmental groups, community groups, and government, people from all departments. And there is a real openness, like there is a real awareness of this problem. And and I've since then had the great privilege of having lots of conversations with policymakers. And I know, on both the CCTI, and I know Oliver's, currently doing a lot of talking about the SFE solution. And I think there is a sense that we're in a crisis. These, we can't afford to let things like Tomago, to let Whyalla, like these are it's not just a political headache it is a political headache for the government, but these are like, huge community impacts if these projects. And so I feel like there is an openness, there is a receptiveness. We haven't had anyone say that's a bad idea, I will say. So I'm just optimistic by design. I don't know who's in charge of them, but I am hopeful. And we only get there, Wes, through dialogue, right? You just got to have the conversations and meet people where they are as well. Because, and also don't assume I don't have all the answers. Like, we're making suggestions. Somewhat, there might be better ways to do this, and we have to understand the limits of our knowledge and be open to the fact that we don't have all the answers, and we can do it better when we do it together, I think. So we need to get better at talking to each other and having long conversations and talk with everyone. The other thing is, it's really easy to get to diss other people's ways of thinking, or to, be hypercritical of things that we don't agree with. But I think that we are facing a huge turning point in this country, and we will only get through it through dialogue.
All right, we are over time. I know there's more questions in the room and more questions online, but we are over time. I just want to thank you again for the great privilege of having you here to give this talk. I'm thinking that I almost wish that we hadn't taken your time, that you were down in Canberra at the Liberal Party room discussions this morning, because I think it would be very valuable being Susan's Lee's ear right now. But anyway, thank you very much for coming. We do have some refreshments here, so please stick around if you want something to eat, and keep an eye on our seminar schedule for next year. I think this is the last one for this year.
We may have one.
Oh, we may have one more. Keep your eyes open for that. But thank you very much, Liz, again.
Thank you.